Everybody, this is Ed Lynch on Surfing Baseball with Ed Lynch. My partner, Bob Nightingale, who's not here today, but he will be with me next week. You can reach our product on Instagram, Twitter, formerly known as Twitter, is now X, Facebook, LinkedIn, Spotify, and YouTube. So my special guests today are Jacob Pomrenke and Dr. David Fletcher. And these two gentlemen are involved with something that's incredibly interesting. It's a civil trial transcript of Shoeless Joe Jackson that occurred 100 years ago this month. And it's really a special issue, a special book. I encourage anybody who has an interest in the history of baseball, especially in the golden era of the 1920s, acquire this book. It's great reading. How we doing, guys?
Doing great.
How we doing?
Thanks for having us on, Ed.
Sure. You know, it's amazing when you look at Joe Jackson. You know, there's a lot of misconceptions going on about him and a lot of other players in that era. You know, my prime example, other than Shoeless Joe, is Ty Cobb. You know, David, we were talking earlier about, you know, 8 men out and a lot of the accuracies, but, you know, Al Stump wrote a book about Ty Cobb after he died and turned him into like a monster. And, you know, a lot of that was not true. And Charles Learson wrote a great book about him, debunking some of the misconceptions and some of the flat out lies about him. I mean, he wasn't the greatest guy in the world, but he wasn't the worst guy in the world. So I think it's interesting now. Here we are 100 years later, bringing a lot of clarity to these situations. So, David, let me start with you. Why this book and why now?
Well, this book was really had to come out because it's an important part of the piece of the puzzle of the Black Sox scandal and the whole story. Is an important historical piece, especially now we're celebrating next week on January 28th, the start of the trial in Milwaukee. It's the only piece of information we have where the principal parties are under oath, and there's competent attorneys, in fact, fantastic legal counsel on both sides who are doing cross-examination and trying to get the truth behind the story. And you've got the principals, Charles Comiskey, and they got Joe Jackson. And it has all the other side characters, gamblers, the 2 pitchers, Eddie Seacott and Lefty Williams, who lost 5 games of the 9-game World Series, who were involved. You got some expert witnesses who are baseball reporters talking about Jackson's play. You even got Jackson's wife testifying about what he did when they got the $5,000. So it's a fascinating study, and it was something that I had to make sure we got out to the public.
Jacob, what's your part in this thing?
Yeah, you know, this is, you know, a great story, and it's a story that you can't even imagine happening today. You know, with a star baseball player suing his former team, and not only suing him, but, you know, it actually going to trial. So being able to see, you know, this testimony in their own words and being able to, you know, go through 14 days worth of trial transcripts is really incredible. So being able to have the opportunity to go through the transcript, Dave and I spent many months going through, you know, line by line, you know, making sure it was all accurate, making sure it all matched up with what the court reporters, you know, put down 100 years ago, and being able to make this available to baseball fans and baseball historians for the future is really an incredible opportunity.
Yeah, I agree. You know, when I retired as an active player, I went to law school, got my law degree at the University of Miami back in 1990, fully intending to be a civil litigator. So this is right up my alley. My brother's been a lawyer in Miami now for 40 years. So whenever I have any questions about civil trials, I call him as my expert witness. Like you said, David, they did have excellent lawyers. Talk a little about Raymond Cannon and the you know, his legacy and who discovered this transcript and how it got back to his grandson, I think is how it came to fruition.
Well, it came to Ray Cannon's son, Robert Cannon, who has a huge connection to baseball. And so let me give you the family history. Ray Cannon was a very firebrand attorney in Milwaukee, went to Marquette Law School, but he also was a baseball player. He actually was a pitcher, and He played with Happy Felsch, who was one of the band 8 players, center fielder, and who lived in Milwaukee like Ray did. And he was an attorney who was like the first sports attorney out there, represented not only to represent Joe Jackson, Happy Felsch, and Sweet Risberg, represented for a short time Red Grange, Lewis, the fighter. And so he was sort of a pioneer, and he was trying to not only represent these players, he was hoping to start a players union back in the 1920s. But that legacy went to his son, Robert Cannon, who became a judge, and then he became the first counsel for the Major League Baseball Players Association, and was also very much involved with Bud Selig in the Milwaukee Brewers development in 1970, and he was very front and center with Bud for that. So Robert is the person who actually got the transcript. They were going to throw this out. It was in a box. And Jacob's not seen the box like I have, but in the bottom of the box, just for your listeners, were like 20 freaking checks, payroll checks to Joe Jackson. Some signed by him, some signed by his wife.
I hope those are in the Hall of Fame now.
They're not. They're not. Wow. And so they were going to throw all these gems out, and the whole transcript, all the exhibits, newspaper articles, and photography. And so some clerk saved this to history, or we wouldn't have it. And so he got it, and Robert allowed Jerome Holtzman, the first Major League Baseball historian, who used to be with the Tribune and the Sun-Times, to make a copy of it. And that's how I eventually got it, because I ended up buying the personal papers of Jerome in 2007. But the Cannons had it. They were very controlled access to the documents. I first saw the transcript in 2003 in June. I was working on research in the Black Sox at that time, and there was a researcher who was just getting started named Gene Carney, who ended up writing a very seminal book called Burying the Black Sox. And we went together to see this transcript, and we really felt that this was like the holy grail of Black Sox research. But he wasn't interested in giving copies. You had limited access, and so it was difficult to get the whole story out bits and pieces. So I went the back door. I ended up buying a copy of it, and I let people use it over the years, but I just really felt the last couple of years that we needed to make the effort to put it out to the public marketplace.
That's an amazing story. Jerome Holtzman and I were very close when I was a general manager of the Chicago Cubs. He was around. He was retired. The Tribune owned our club, so we all worked for the Tribune at one time. And I remember him coming in after I made a trade. I forget who the trade was, and he said, "You remind me of Frank Lane." And I had to look up who Frank Lane was, but it was an old GM in Jerome's time. And he was an amazing historian, and it was a wealth of knowledge. So, Jacob, when you got your hands on this, what was your function in this in terms of editing? I see it's edited by you guys. What did that entail for you?
Well, the biggest thing was cleaning it up. The original court reporter document was almost 1,700 pages long, but it was double spaced, a lot of legal formatting in there. And so our goal was to clean it up, digitize it, make it available so that, people could actually read it in the 21st century and make sense of it, because, there's some errors, some spelling errors, some grammatical errors in there. So, we cleaned it all up, made it a readable document, and also, digitized it for the first time, because the only 2 copies that existed were, one up in Milwaukee and, one that Dr. Fletcher had. So being able to, again, get that into an electronic form so that, we can make a book out of it and make an ebook out of it as well, so that it's now searchable. Just, a lot of cleanup, a lot of going through each page just to make sure that, what happened in the courtroom ended up on the page. And so, we took a lot of time to make sure that it, it all reads well. And it's a very dramatic story when you go through it now. But, that was our job, was to just clean it up, make it available, and get it out there.
You know, in a civil trial, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I'll try to be as simple as I can. You know, you have, by the way, for people that still don't realize this trial is about Shoeless Joe Jackson suing the Chicago White Sox for back pay. You know, a lot of people, when they first see this, they'll say, oh, it must be the criminal trial. It's not. It's a civil trial, and it occurred, as we can see, a couple of years later. And he was trying to get $16,711 or something like that in back pay. So when you read it, he's the plaintiff. So the respondent is the ball club. And so he'll be under direct examination by his lawyer, Raymond Cannon. And David, who is George Hundell? What is his relationship to Charles Comiskey? Was he an employee? Was he the general counsel, or did he farm this out?
Well, I think it's a great question, Ed. So George Hundell was had a lawyer with his own firm, and they historically have been acquired by a firm known around the country now called Michael Best, and they had a Milwaukee location. And so George Hundell was not general counsel for the White Sox. Their general counsel actually testified in this trial, Alfred Austrian, and he was also general counsel for your old ball club, the Cubs. And he was sort of the Michael Cohen of the day. He was a fixer for Charles Comiskey and for Wrigley, and he's the one who sort of managed their crisis management when the scandal broke. But Hundell had to be hired because Austrian couldn't represent the White Sox in court in Wisconsin because the White Sox were incorporated in Wisconsin as opposed to Illinois. And so that's where they had to be sued. There was some.
I did not know that.
Yeah, there was some consideration of doing a federal diversity type of thing, but that because they're a Wisconsin corporation, they had to have counsel. And so Hundell was the local counsel in Milwaukee. And he did a great job for Comiskey. What he did was brilliant, was that he worked with Austrian to get the transcripts from the grand jury. I mean, there's this mistaken historical belief that these grand jury transcripts came out of thin air, and that Comiskey was, lawyers were being less than above board because grand jury is supposed to be, protected communication, but they were already been out in the public because in 1921, Judge Friend, who was the head of the criminal trial, had allowed those grand jury testimonies to go in. And so they were actually read in the 21 trial. They're part of the court record. So what George Hundell did, he just contacted the state's attorney's office in Cook County. He got copies of the transcripts. And he brilliantly used those when he deposed Lefty Williams and Eddie Seacott. It just basically asked him questions about their prior testimony. And when he did Joe Jackson's two civil trial depositions down in Georgia, he held it in the weeds. He didn't bring up Joe Jackson's grand jury testimony. He just held back on that. And so that was his strategy after you appropriately talked about. It was Joe Jackson who had to make the case in chief in the beginning. So on the cross-examination after Jackson testified, George Hundell pulls out the grand jury testimony and basically impeaches him. There's two different stories.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's certainly the smoking gun, the grand jury testimony. After reading that, it's pretty evident. And we'll go back to that. Jacob, the thing that struck me reading when I started the beginning, how contentious this was. I mean, the number of objections. I mean, every question. What was your batting average last year? Objection, immaterial. I mean, if I'm sitting on a jury, and juries were much different back then. It's all white men, I assume.
No, there were women on the jury.
Oh, were there?
Yeah,
because I read the final. The judge addressed the jury. He said, "Gentlemen."
No, I assume it
was all men. Okay.
No.
Well, anyway, so if I'm sitting on a jury and a guy is, vehemently objecting, I'm going to get turned off by that a little bit because I'm thinking either he's trying to hide something, or my goal is to get the hell out of here. And this guy's just delaying on silly questions like, "What did you hit last year?" Did you see that all through the transcript, Jacob? Like a lot of contentious headbutting going on.
Absolutely. And, that's actually one of the more dramatic parts of the trial is that, both sides lawyers were really going after it. going after each other from the first minute of the trial on. And, Ray Cannon, who represented Joe Jackson, he was known as a firebrand. I mean, this was his reputation in court, but he was also very, very successful. He, at one point, had won over 100 consecutive jury trials,
wow.
In Wisconsin. So, he had a great reputation, and this was just his style. But, it certainly turned some people off for sure. But, this generally worked for him. And, it did work for him with the jury. The jury awarded Joe Jackson his back pay. But because
that's amazing to me,
but because he was impeached by his old grand jury testimony, in which he completely admitted fixing the World Series, accepting the bribe money and everything. And then in 1924, when he gets on the stand, he basically
gets amnesia.
Yeah, he answers questions. He says, "Oh, I didn't even answer that question. These are not my answers." And so the judge, is infuriated with this and says, "Well, one of these stories has to be wrong. You were under oath in Chicago at the grand jury. You're under oath here. One of these is wrong. It doesn't matter which one it is, but I believe you're lying now. When you're denying being involved in the Black Sox scandal at all." So it's a fascinating, exchange between the judge and Shoeless Joe, to see it. But his lawyer, we've been talking about this for a while now. His lawyer, could have helped him out a little bit more and prepared him for that old grand jury testimony. It's 100 years later. We can't get into his head, but that was really the fatal flaw in this case for Joe Jackson, was, not being prepared, to be, presented with his own testimony.
Yes, it's pretty obvious that he was not prepared. But, I read in the judge's words, he says, after the verdict comes in the court, it may interest you, members of the jury, to know that the court has bound over Mr. Jackson on the charge of perjury. That's not a very good reaction to their verdict. And Mr. Phelps on charges of perjury, and that perjury stands undisputed and admitted in this case. You have failed in the discharge of your duty. How you gentlemen could answer, and that's where I thought it was an all-male jury, how you gentlemen can answer some of those questions in the fact of that testimony the court cannot understand. Phelps is undisputedly impeached here, and Mr. Jackson on his own testimony stands impeached and accuses him and convicts himself of perjury. It needed no court. It needed no jury to determine that Mr. Jackson determined that himself. Is there anything, gentlemen, that you desire to say? Any motions to make? I mean, those are strong words for a jury. Usually, they thank you for doing your constitutional duty, and now he's airing these people out in open court. That's unprecedented, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, the jury, they actually. Which will be in the companion book, is about the picking of the jury. Most of them really didn't know about Joe Jackson or baseball.
Really?
It was a huge, it was a national story. A national story in the New York Times, Associated Press, Sporting News. And there was a lot of fanfare where there was belief that some of the jury was getting tampered with, and there was some press manipulation. I mean, this was, a huge thing for the city of Milwaukee. And it was a major event for the start of the presidential election year in 1924.
Yeah, and I made the assumption that they had, I don't know how many people were on the jury, 12, I assume. 12 sycophants, members of the Chicago White Sox, fan club. I mean, and it's amazing to me. They had the grand jury and testimony. So, taking a step back, they had the grand jury testimony. They get indicted on the criminal charges. They get acquitted. Now they sue in civil court, and they win again. And then finally, the judge, I guess, put an end to this madness, saying, "What are you people looking at? Am I wrong in that assumption?"
I mean, that's basically, how it wrapped up. I mean, he set aside the verdict, and Joe, later settled. I think he appealed later, but, later settled for pennies, basically. But yeah, I mean, sometimes juries are going to do what juries are going to do. And
no doubt,
the one in Chicago for the criminal trial, acquitted them, despite there being quite a lot of evidence that at least some of the, Black Sox players were involved. And here, the same way. I mean, they awarded Joe Jackson his back pay. You know, and so, you know, sometimes that's the risk you take with a jury trial. And I think that's, you know, something that Joe Jackson's lawyer, Ray Cannon, was counting on, was that, you know, maybe they've got stars in their eyes, or, you know, maybe they just, you know, see Charles Comiskey and, you know, the big bad owner, you know, and that's how they're going to rule. But yeah, you never know with some of these trials how it's going to end up.
Yeah, it surprises me. You know, it's called judgment, notwithstanding the verdict. I mean, if there's clearly no evidence or evidence contrary to the jury's verdict, the judge can step in, and this guy stepped in. What happened, David, in the criminal trial? Was that what was the judge? Was there any corruption involved in your estimate?
No, there was no corruption. Actually, I don't know if you know the connection. The judge in the criminal trial was Hugo Friend. His daughter is a well-known philanthropist in Chicago named Cindy Pritzker. And he actually was a 1896 gold medal.
Is that the governor's daughter?
No, related in the family, but
okay.
Not the governor's daughter, no.
Okay.
And so Judge Friend was one of his first trials. He ended up doing the Leopold trial as well. And he ended up, after the trial, Comiskey gave him a season's pass for Comiskey Park the rest of his life. He was a White Sox fan. Yeah, he was a White Sox fan, so to 1964, and when he died. And he was actually one of the few firsthand sources that Elliot Asanoff had when he wrote 8 Men Out in 1962 and 1963. But you know, there was no corruption. The judge, you know, basically he got a sympathetic jury. You talked about White Sox sympathetic type of fans. You know, they were wowed by the Black Sox. And in fact, Jacob's written a very famous article in the Saber publication about after the jury verdict came back, you know, making them not guilty. The jury and the Black Sox players went out to this dinner at an Italian restaurant and celebrated together. It was sort of unorthodox in a trial.
Yeah.
I mean, they were really lucky. I mean, the evidence is pretty clear that they were guilty. At least some of them were guilty. And that's the nice thing about our book, is it actually clearly establishes how the fix started in New York, and it was started by Chick Gandil and Eddie Seacott. And that's the nice thing about this book, is we really tell the complete story of what happened. They got lucky. They kind of got the you know, the O.J. Simpson, you know, not guilty type of situation. But then, you know, later on, you know, Simpson got stuck in the civil case, and then Joe Jackson got stuck in a civil case, put a lot of money and effort, and got nothing out of it.
Yeah. What was Jacob? What was Rosenthal's? Was Arthur Rosenberg?
Arnold Rothstein.
Rothstein. I'm sorry, Arnold Rothstein. I should know that. What was his role in this thing? Was that ever clarified, or?
So he was basically, you know, exactly what we've all grown up believing. He was the financier of this entire scandal. He did a very good job of keeping his own name out of it. And so he was never indicted by the grand jury. He never faced any charges for this. But he absolutely funded the bribery. And, you know, it was one of his lieutenants and known business partners named Nat Evans, who met with the players and, you know, who helped pay them off. And, you know, the money had to come from Rothstein, because he was basically the only one who had it in that world. You know, he was known as the big bankroll and from New York. And so, you know, he absolutely, you know, was involved, but he was able to stay out of it. He was very politically connected in New York. You know, his lawyers helped, you know, with the Chicago grand jury and made sure that his name stayed out of it. But he was very involved, and his business partners and his lieutenants were very involved as well. He just was able to stay above the fray.
Yeah, he did testify, Ed, in October of 1920 at the grand jury, and basically wanted to clear his name, but he was a smokescreen.
And we don't have that testimony. We're still looking for the full grand jury testimony from 1920. It would be great to have that.
That would be awesome.
This transcript in our book, you know, has bits and pieces of Eddie Seacott and Joe Jackson and Lefty Williams grand jury testimony, but there were dozens and dozens of witnesses.
I bet.
And, you know, some of that was covered in the newspapers, but it was often reported badly and inaccurately. So, you know, every paper would would repeat different testimony, in a different way. So maybe one day we'll find the full grand jury records, and maybe one day we'll find the full criminal trial records too. But for now, this is the one we have, the civil trial.
Well, this is a great stuff. Even if you don't find that, as you said, they're cited. The grand jury is cited many times in this testimony, so it's great stuff. I read your afterword in here, Jacob. You already said about it's almost impossible to imagine in 2023 one of baseball's biggest stars has sued the team's principal owner, and they both take the stand to testify under oath. I mean, it's unbelievable. And about their contract negotiations, revenue and expenses. I mean, ownership now guards their revenues with, close to their vest. They don't want anybody to know what they're making, and it's their right under the law. As you said, in fact, there's no way it could happen today. Too much money's at stake on all sides, and baseball teams closely guard any public disclosure of their financial details. You said a pre-trial settlement would surely be negotiated. There is no doubt about that. These guys don't want to clean their laundry in public. But you also say, and I'm a big believer in this, I'm very worried about the future of baseball as it pertains to gambling. I remember when Bowie Kuhn suspended Mickey Mantle and Willie Mays because they were greeters at a casino in Atlantic City. And now a pitcher's on the mound in the World Series, and they have the logo of DraftKings like etched into the back of the mound. I mean, that's how far we've come. And you also wrote in here, you can't watch a baseball game today without seeing an advertisement encouraging fans to visit a sports book and use their smartphones to place a bet on the very next pitch. And it's true. And, history tells us that it's practically inevitable, that there'll be some sort of scandal. I hope you're wrong, but I think you're right. And the temptation is there, and it almost becomes a crime of not a crime, but of convenience. Rule breaking. Rule 21 is very specific in Major League Baseball. I mean, something as ridiculous as you're sitting in the clubhouse and your star pitcher slips and breaks his ankle in the bathroom and you have your phone there. I mean, it's just too easy. I played during the era of Pete Rose, where Bud took all the phones out of the clubhouse. Nobody had cell phones because, Pete's calling his bookie during the games, allegedly. So I do see some issues going forward on this whole issue, but I hope I'm wrong. Anything you want to say in closing, guys?
I mean, I'll add, I hope I'm wrong too, but the history of sports and sports gambling shows that none of us are ever wrong on that particular issue. I mean, it is just a scandal waiting to happen. It's just a matter of how and when. Is it going to be exactly like the Black Sox scandal was 100+ years ago? No, it probably won't. Too many things are different, but everybody's got a price, and the reality is, as you said, the opportunity is there. And that's one of the reasons the Black Sox scandal did happen in 1919, is because they saw what they thought was a very easy opportunity to make some money. Gambling was rampant. It was very easy to place a bet on the next pitch in the bleachers at Wrigley Field. You just couldn't use a smartphone in 1919, but you could absolutely place a bet, on anything that moved at Wrigley Field 100 years ago. And so, the opportunity is there again today. And the stakes are much higher. The money is so rampant, and, people have a price, and that's, the people who have the ability to affect not only the result, the wins and losses, but just the next pitch. I mean, you can make a lot of money on spot bets. You can make a lot of money, on just very little, prop bets over the course of the game. And a lot of money can change hands that way. And so, there's going to be something, unfortunately. Major League Baseball, has a very big vested interest in making sure that a scandal like this does not happen again. And so the security measures are much more sophisticated today. But, it continues to happen in all sports all around the world. It will happen again in Major League Baseball. It's just a matter of when and, what they can do to try to, curb that and put some disincentives for people not to engage in that behavior, especially if you're employed in the baseball industry. That's, definitely where they're trying to draw the line and hold the line. So we'll see how it all shakes out.
Absolutely. It's something that needs to be monitored. And as you said, it's so much easier now. gambling was so rampant back in this era during the 10s and 20s. I mean, it was ridiculous when you read some of the stories, and guys dodged the bullet. Ty Cobb dodged the bullet. Tris Speaker dodged the bullet. I mean, there was a lot of gambling going on, and people are people. And the one constant between 1924 and 2024 is that human beings are involved in the game. And, you know, it's just a matter of human behavior. David, what's next? The book? Any timeline?
Well, the companion book we're trying to get out by June. So we're writing some final chapters, and Jacob's going to edit that. It's going to really get an in-depth legal analysis of the trial. They'll talk a lot about the jury, about the women when they were interviewed to be on the jury. It'll also give a career perspective on Charles Comiskey, what he did after the trial. He was still facing a lawsuit by Happy Felsch that he had to fight off. It's also going to talk about Ray Cannon's career. But basically, it's going to put a little bit of a historical lesson in 1924 in the context of the times. We really wanted to emphasize this because this was just like our current situation. The past is prologue. Back during that trial, we got out of the flu epidemic. Now in 2024, we're getting out of COVID. There's a lot of similarities.
Absolutely.
And so we wanted to kind of feature that. So it's a story that never is going to stop. Fascinating. It's a Greek tragedy and some great players. And I really appreciate your interest, Ed, especially for you being a former general manager, of understanding these negotiations and what it's like for you to had to testify and share some of the discussions you had with players. So
that was never going to happen. I can tell you that right now.
Well, I think when we first had a conversation, I could go how excited you were about this book, but that's what we wanted to see. And the fact, I was well aware that you went to the University of Miami Law School after you got out of your baseball career. That's, you got hired by the Tribune Company. So I'm just glad you liked it. And I think that you've got some great viewpoints that we wanted to get out in the book. And Jacob and I are really proud of it. Again, the 100th anniversary is coming up on the 28th. And it's just been really joyous to see how people have reacted to it.
Well, I'll say two things. This is a book of facts and not opinion. You can get right to the facts of the case. And I really love that. And there's no opinion involved in terms of people sugarcoating or unfairly criticizing people. And number two, I can tell this is a labor of love for you guys. And I think that's just great. And as I love this stuff, I love this era. And to see something like this, it brings that era to life more than anything else could. So, gentlemen, thank you so much. It's been great. I look forward to the next book. Certainly put me on your mailing list for the next book, David, if you don't mind. And we'll come back and revisit at that time.
All right.
Thanks so much,
all right. See you. Thanks again. All right.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Bye.